I'm talking today to those who are learning to do qualitative research. So now I have gone over some of the general principles and practices of qualitative analysis. Let me now illustrate what all this might mean in practice by analyzing a small bit of data from one of my own studies. Of course, let me remind you that this is one example of how analysis might happen. It is not the only way to do things, merely what I did. My hope is that you can pick out of my examples some of the things that I've been talking about till now. The segment of data I'm going to put up shortly comes from a study of a particular strategy in Ontario called Early and Safe Return to Work. It's a strategy for getting injured workers back to work after work-related injury or illness. The policy revolved around returning to work before full recovery at jobs modified to suit the disability and stage of recovery. Now, the study objectives were to characterize the experience of injured workers and employers with Ontario's system of return to work, and to explain their experiences in relation to the social structures in which they were embedded, particularly the nature of work life in small workplaces, early and safe return to work policy, and institutional practices. The methods we used involved using a range of different materials, including documents such as policy and regulations, and interviews with workers and employers. In the latter, we had them tell us in their own terms about their businesses, their jobs, their injury, their working lives, their relations with co-workers or bosses, and also about injury and the return to work. Then, out of their talk, out of what they recounted to us, we distilled some key dimensions of their experiences and then tried to explain or account for their experiences using empirical data in conjunction with various types of theoretical inference. Here is a little example to show what kind of a process this was. Here I'm going to put up an excerpt from an interview with an injured worker, Joe. It was taped and then transcribed and printed out as a text. Of course, much is lost in this first translation from oral interview to text, the tone, the context, the appearance, everything. These transcripts then constitute the data in this case, along with, of course, extensive notes of the interview and observations. We break into this interview just as the interviewer has asked Joe whether he's had any previous injuries before this one. So in response to that question, Joe starts in. No, says Joe. Oh, the odd ache and pain and sprain and wound and whatnot. But you just kind of shook it off. It hurt for a couple of days or whatever, and away you went again. And the interviewer says, nothing that caused any work absences? Joe says, no. This claim that I'm on now is the first I've ever had in my career. I mean, as a mechanic, you've always got what I call war wounds, scrapes and gouges and chunks of skin missing here and there, whatever. But it's all part of the game, although there are those guys who might make something of it. So how do we think about these data? How can we interpret them? We can do this in layers, moving increasingly to more abstract and general takes on what is happening. A first cut is at the level of straight content. Some objective facts are made evidence with minimal interpretation. We see that Joe is a mechanic, that Joe has not had any previous injury that he considers serious, that this is his first compensation claim, that lots of minor injuries happen to mechanics like Joe, that there are some workers who think or act differently than Joe. Another set of observations of a somewhat more interpretive nature can also be made. Here, there are other facts in the data of a different sort. These are the presence of what might be considered perceptions or attitudes or beliefs. That Joe isn't all that concerned about minor injuries. That Joe sees such injuries as just part of the job. They're still sort of facts, but they're also a little less factual than the earlier kind. These two levels of analysis emerge from a set of assumptions the researcher makes about what the data mean. They are extracted from a situation understood as being about Joe answering questions asked of him and providing the researcher with facts about what he thinks and does. Joe is an informant. At this level of analysis, the words mean only what they appear to on the surface, in their most literal sense. What he says then is seen as information. We may consider whether his report is correct or whether he's lying or something, but the underlying assumption is that the research task is about getting at an objective external reality out there and describing it the way it really is. Both levels of analysis that I've described here reflect a realist conception of reality. Joe has these ideas. He takes this posture. These facts reflect what Joe is out there when he's not in the interview. But another sort of analysis flows from a different set of assumptions about what these data mean. You could, for example, take what is called in qualitative research a discursive or narrative perspective on what Joe is saying. The focus here is less on what he says, but on how he says it and the meaning of what he does in his narrative. It views what is being said as embedded in a social exchange, in social interaction. This perspective sees what people say and do not as a reflection of some external objective state that exists out there independently of the context in which they occur, but as being produced in the course of interaction. Joe's words are seen in terms of achieving reality as opposed to reflecting reality. So from this perspective, the issue is, what is Joe doing or achieving by what he says, particularly the way he says it, the words he chooses, the structure of his story. And by doing, I do not necessarily mean that this is conscious or deliberate, but it is happening nonetheless. From this perspective, we might suggest that Joe is representing himself as a certain kind of person, a certain kind of worker. We see this in a variety of ways. It does not just pop out of our imagination. We see it between the lines, implied by the phrasing, the structure of the narrative. For example, look at the way he uses the pronoun you, not the first person I. This phrasing seems to suggest that it is a class of people that do it, that he belongs to that group. There is possibly also a hint of a normative phrasing, that this is what one should do. Further, he refers to war wounds, which associates his injuries with some sense of heroism, duty, endurance. This metaphor speaks not just to how Joe understands his own body and situation, but also speaks to how he portrays his body to the interviewer, or to the audience he might be implicitly speaking to by participating in the research. His insistence and emphasis on denying previous injury claims flags the possibility that he does not see a history of injury claims as a desirable thing, that it might convey something about him that is problematic to him. Contributing to our efforts to interpret these data is our observation of Joe's general reaction to the interviewer's mention of previous injury and claims. His body language, the emphasis in his voice, his choice of what part of the question to respond to, etc. These all signal a response that needs attention. We also note that he's reacting in this way even though he's being interviewed by an interviewer who was an injured worker herself, a context that makes his reaction all the more noteworthy. All of these varied signals constitute data that contribute to the interpretation. Joe says somewhat obliquely that other workers might make a bigger deal out of injury, which thereby acknowledges and thereby socially constructs a category of workers who do make more of their injuries. By contrast to his previous statement, he is the type that shook it off and carries on with this work. Joe is conveying that he puts his work foremost, ignoring pain or bodily damage. Okay, so what? What do we make of this? What do we do next with this interpretation? The point is not whether or not Joe really does what he says, or that there really are workers who make a big deal of their injuries. The point is that this representation says something about Joe and his experience of injury, about how he sees work and injury, about his identity as a worker. Various types of thought operations can be brought into play to help analyze such data. We ask, for example, why is Joe representing himself in this way? What would prompt him to respond in this way and not to another? No, what would prompt him to respond in this way and not another way? What does this representation tell us about the context in which injury and return to work play out? We can also move to interpreting what Joe is saying here in relation to what he said elsewhere in the interview. We link the way he responds here to the way he responds to other concepts and in other contexts, particularly by comparing situations which seem to invoke similar or different types of reactions. We consider what he is saying as it supports or not a set of ideas that we notice in other injured workers' accounts, an abiding concern that others are suspicious that they are not really hurt, or are exaggerating their injuries to gain time off work or compensation or light work, a concern that they are not believed and trusted, the idea that they are fraudulent and misusing the compensation system. So moving our analysis to a more abstract level, we observe that injured workers constantly combat imputations that they are misrepresenting their injury and disability, and that they are abusing the compensation system. This conceptualization made it possible to understand many other things that injured workers said and did, and led us to begin to see that much of what they did was part of a delicate performance to assert their credibility, their moral integrity, a performance that was critical to being seen as complying with the regulations and to achieving or sustaining their compensation claims. In the context of this emerging analysis, we can interpret what Joe is doing in this excerpt as part of the performance that he must put on, his efforts to convey that he is a morally sound individual. He is not a wimp who stops work for the slightest thing. He's the type of guy who ignores his wounds, carries on regardless. He's a committed and loyal worker who even subordinates his own physical discomfort to his work. He acknowledges that there may be workers who are fraudulent, but he is not one of them. Joe is not saying this explicitly, but on the basis of what we know from elsewhere and the emerging sense we are making of the data as a whole, we, the analysts, interpret these data as being about Joe's attempts to resist and manage the negative imputations of others that can affect his life. Our interpretation is simultaneously informed by and contributes to the building of what became a core conceptual and explanatory framework in the study, what we call the Discourse of Abuse. We see, for example, how this discourse is actually created in interaction. We see Joe participating in the creation of the notion of abusers. Actually, fraud is very low, but there is a very strong public myth of widespread cheating. And so Joe, by referring, Joe is participating in the construction and reproduction of this myth, which then returns to haunt him by requiring him to demonstrate that he's not one of them. We move on from Joe's talk, and we see that, in fact, the discourse of abuse is pervasive in return to work and compensation system. It is embedded in the Workers' Compensation Board website, the WSIB, for example, where they had a hotkey on the homepage to a special investigation unit, i.e. a snitch line for suspected abuse. We see it embedded in the forms used to report injury, a box for employers to report suspicious circumstances. Or in the doctor's form, we see it in the fact that the doctor has to check off what he or she thinks about the worker's readiness to go back to work, but only the option of not going back to work requires an explanation. These things were all there in our data all along, but it was only in the light of the discourse of abuse and our focus on the performance of injured workers to exclude themselves from this discourse that we were actually able to see them in the data. The data from Joe, as in this data segment, became intelligible through the combination of data from many places and through the lens of a particular perspective. In this case, the notion of discourse and how it governs human behavior. This is what it means to theorize the data. The theorizing, or progressive generalization or abstraction, was grounded in the empirical data, but moved beyond them to things that are less observable, less visible. The theorization does not generate itself out of the data alone. It takes off from the data and is grounded in it, but it is produced by the analyst in a process that involves drawing on existing disciplinary concepts and generating new ones. Thus, for a given set of data, there isn't just one right interpretation. A phenomenon can be understood in many different ways, depending on the level of abstraction and the standpoint of the research and the disciplinary base of the analyst. The evaluation of any particular interpretation depends on how well the analyst puts forward a case for a particular interpretation, whether it is convincing, useful, generic in application. So, to close, let me just pull together and reframe some of the key points I've made about qualitative analysis. The distinctive feature of qualitative research lies less in the data than in the analysis. Analysis runs throughout the research. It is inseparable from all the other activities and is intimately related to how data were collected. Qualitative analysis moves beyond the face value of data because meaning is not inherent in the words and cannot just be read off the surface. The meaning resides in the relationship between the data and the context, and in the level of analysis and standpoint and theoretical frame of reference of the researcher. Qualitative analysis can move beyond subjective experience. Understanding actors' viewpoints may be a necessary condition of social knowledge, but it is not a sufficient one. Subjective experiences are structured socially. Hence, from the point of view of policy and practice, it might also be important to determine how subjective experiences are produced and how they relate to other outcomes. Qualitative analysis moves from first-order lay accounts and concrete empirical observations to second-order accounts, identifying the non-empirically observable social structures and processes that produce the experience. Concepts and theory are instruments of analysis. Thus, in my return to work study, the notion of performance, a dramaturgical conceptualization of social interaction, which I adapted from sociological theory, in particular Goffman, was a key device for integrating a whole range of observations about how injured workers experienced and responded to the return to work experience. But theoretical frameworks cannot be just applied arbitrarily. They have to work as explanations of concrete reality, and great care is needed to avoid subverting data to exciting transcendent stories. The real strength of qualitative inquiry lies in its ability to conceptualize what is going on in ways that cast a new and different light on the subject. The findings of qualitative analysis consist of a conceptual apparatus for understanding the phenomenon under investigation. For example, our contribution in the return to work study was not just to document that injured workers felt stigmatized by their injury, but to characterize this experience in more abstract theoretical terms as a moral regulatory discourse that can have profound implications for relations at work, disability, and return to work. Thus, qualitative analysis aims not for statistically generalizable findings, but for conceptually generalizable ones. Thus, the knowledge generated in my return to work study was not about how widespread the discourse of abuse might be, but about conceptualizing its presence, its nature, how it operates, where it comes from, and what kind of effects it has. The generalizability of the findings, then, reside in the strength of the second-order conceptualization, in the extent to which they reflect general social processes, and the extent to which they can be generalized as concepts across particular empirical domains. For example, the discourse of abuse and its effect on social relations has generalizability beyond the particular instance of Ontario's return to work system. It has relevance to other situations with similar generative mechanisms. For examples, in similar contested sites of entitlements to public monies or social support, as in social welfare. So there you have it, a glimpse of what might be involved in doing something analytically with qualitative data. As you can see, it is not a linear or straightforward process. It can be very demanding and stress-provoking because there's no necessary relationship between what you do and what you produce. Ultimately, it comes from your own ability to creatively put the analytic pieces together. Ultimately, all research, qualitative and quantitative, has to be made sense of, has to be interpreted. And this is a little glimpse of how such interpretation might be achieved in the ever-fascinating domain of qualitative research.